All right, we'll get going here. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us to another edition of Long's Coffee Break. My name is Aaron Morris, and today we're going to be talking about the Department of Energy efficiency regulations, and really specifically the new metrics EER2, SEER2, and HSPF2. So SEER2, what is it? When does it go into effect? How's it being regulated? So I guess recently with SEER2, I ran into SEER2 on a project that I've been involved in for over a year now in the design. We had equipment specified and project finally moves forward and go to submit on the project, and looking at our performance data sheets, all of a sudden our energy efficiency looks like it has gone down significantly and no longer meets the requirements for the job. So this was alarming. Contact the factory, and I'm asking them, how did your efficiency go down? What's going on? And they come back and tell me, no, the equipment's just as efficient. It's the same equipment. Nothing's changed there. We just are rating it to the new standard. SEER2, which I had never heard of before. I guess I live in a commercial bubble, and this project was kind of a multi-family residential. It was actually a dormitory. So we're running into more and more of these projects where we have single phase equipment, and that's where SEER2 comes in. So SEER2 is a new metric for AHRI test standard 210-240. And they have increased the duct static pressure from 0.1 to 0.5 inches of static pressure on this equipment. And it's designed to be a more realistic test and provide better information for determining an end user's efficiency and energy usage. But with that additional duct static pressure, we're using more input power on the fan, and so we wind up with a reduced value, and that's why SEER2 EER2 was created, so you could distinguish between equipment that's on the new test standard versus the old test standard. As of January 1st, all single phase equipment, AC equipment, heat pump equipment that's manufactured after January 1st, 2023, needs to be compliant with the new SEER2 standards. And this is being regulated across the country, although it does vary a little bit by region, which we'll get into a little bit. So real quick recap on the metrics that we have been using and will continue to use on the commercial equipment anyway. EER, energy efficiency ratio, SEER, seasonal efficiency ratio, and HSPF, heating seasonal performance factor. If you look at EER, we are comparing the output capacity in BTUs to the input power in watts. So as an example here, on a 1-ton AC unit doing 12,000 BTUs of capacity, if it was using 1,200 watts of input power, it would have an EER of 10. And this EER metric is giving us that full load operating point, right? So we get a full load efficiency when we're looking at EER. SEER is calculated the same way, except instead of just looking at one operating point, it's looking at an entire cooling season. And that's defined by AHRI, testing the equipment at different operating points and then given a weighted value to come up with a weighted average for that seasonal energy efficiency ratio, but still comparing BTU capacity to input watts. And then HSPF is very similar to SEER, except we're looking at a heating season, again, defined by AHRI test standard. And I threw COP in here. COP is not changing to COP2, but COP is a little bit different in that it's comparing apples to apples as opposed to BTUs to watts. COP is comparing watts to watts or BTUs to BTUs. So you wind up with lower numbers, typical heat pump system. might range between a COP of 3 and 4 for output capacity compared to input energy. Now, the new EER2, SEER2, HSPF2 is calculated in the same way. The only difference is the test standard that's used to determine the output capacity and the input power is using a higher duct static pressure. So we're going to use more watts. And so our SEER2, EER2, HSPF2 numbers, those values are going to wind up being reduced because it's a harder test. So look, the Department of Energy, they implemented new regulations, which is driving all these changes, right? So in 2018, the DOE began the first phase of a 6-year plan to increase efficiency on HVAC equipment. The second phase of this plan began January 1st, 2023. So all commercial air conditioning units and heat pump equipment from 65,000 BTUs to 760,000 BTUs had to increase in efficiency, up to about 15%. I think all of us have kind of felt that. I know I certainly have in dealing with, lead time issues with having to, old equipment getting obsolete and factories kind of retooling to get the equipment built post January 1st that meets the new efficiency requirements. So I was familiar with all of that side of things on kind of the more commercial equipment, the larger 3-phase, greater than 65,000 BTU equipment. But in addition to that, the DOE increased the minimum efficiency requirements for single-phase AC and heat pump systems below 65,000 BTUs. And when they did, they came out with the new test standard also to meet the DOE regulation, which is where the SEER2 metric comes in. So these charts, the one on top kind of shows the old, now this is single phase, under 65,000 BTU equipment. The one on top is the older requirement, and the one on the bottom is the new after January 1st, 2023 requirement. And if we compare like split AC in the northern region, then the old requirement was a 13 SEER, and the new requirement is a 13.4, but you see the column header on that bottom chart has changed to SEER2. So it doesn't seem like a big change, 13 to 13.4, but that's under the more strict test requirement. And so, as a rule of thumb, because there is no defined way to go from SEER to SEER2, but what we're seeing is equipment that was rated as a 14 SEER unit is now rated as a 13.4 SEER2 unit. Right, so essentially on that split AC in the north, we went from 13 SEER to 14 SEER, but it's rated as a 13.4 SEER2 unit. Right. If we look at packaged AC in the north, the old requirement was 14 SEER. The new requirement is 13.4 SEER2. So essentially, you can use the same equipment there, but it has to be tested and rated to the new SEER2 standard. And this map kind of gives you more of a visual, for those different regions, which you can see Colorado is in the northern region, which is a good thing for us. There's a couple advantages there. One, the efficiency requirements are a little less in the north because in the south you have a higher cooling demand, so they require more efficient equipment. But also in the north, we are allowed to use equipment that was manufactured before January 1st, 2023. If that equipment met the energy efficiency requirements at that time, we can still use it in the north to use up that existing inventory. In the south, there are some exceptions, but you know, you're not allowed to do that unless you meet several exceptions, which we won't get into. But know that in the north, we can use that existing inventory to use that up. And then, you know, you see here, split AC, we got to meet the 13.4 SEER2, 13.4 SEER2 on packaged air conditioning. And then on split system heat pumps, we got to meet a 14.3 SEER2 and a 7.5 HSPF2. And then on packaged heat pumps, that's a 13.4 SEER2 and a 6.7 HSPF2. Those are the new requirements for the northern region. So then that gets us to AHRI. AHRI responded to the DOE requirements by updating their standard 210-240 to include that additional duct static on their testing. And from the forward on AHRI 210-240, you can see they updated their test and they have added new performance metrics, EER2, SEER2, and HSPF2. And then they removed water-cooled and evaporative-cooled products and put those into a different standard, 340, 360, and they removed IER part load testing from this standard. And this chart comes from AHRI 210-240 and just shows that half-inch static pressure requirement for conventional air conditioners and heat pumps. So that's how the test is being conducted now. And then this page comes from the 2021 IEC table C403. And you can see on equipment smaller than 65,000 BTUs, they're still listing the EER, but then under the test procedure, they're listing AHRI 210-240. And if you go down to the notes, which might be hard to read, so I blew them up and put them on the side there, but notes B and C call out that single phase US air-cooled air conditioners less than 65,000 BTUs are regulated as a consumer product by the Department of Energy Code of Federal Regulations. So DOE 10 CFR 430 calls out those efficiencies. And you know, in that same section, if you go to that, it's calling out efficiencies for refrigerators and freezers, but it also calls out, you know, for the residential single phase air conditioners. SEER and SEER2 values for single phase products are set by the U.S. Department of Energy. And then note C, DOE 10 CFR 430 subpart B, appendix M1 includes the test procedures effective January 1st, 23, and those have now been incorporated into AHRI 210-240 2023. So if we go, you know, and take a look at the Department of Energy's website, this is a snapshot from that DOE 10 CFR 430, and you can see those SEER2 and HSPF2 minimum efficiency requirements. So that kind of ties it all together from the DOE to, you know, AHRI and their test standards, and then International Energy Code, kind of referring back to the DOE and AHRI. And so, you know, as it turns out, the equipment is meeting the efficiency requirements. The values are lower because if you look on the tech data sheet, they're calling out SEER2 now. So, you know, how's the industry responding to this? Well, Energy Star has updated their information. So they are now including HSPF2, SEER2, and EER2 metrics for meeting Energy Star. And then if we're looking at Daikin, here's a brochure page for Daikin heat pumps. And you can see they put a line item, 2023 compliant, yes, or, you know, and they're all saying yes there, right? So they've tested them and they have the SEER2 and the HSPF2 metrics there. And then here's another manufacturer. This one's from Friedrich on their VRP packaged heat pumps. And you can see again, they're listing SEER2, EER2. They're not listing the old metric, you know, so you got to use that. If you go down to the bottom under the heat pumps performance, they're listing the HSPF2 requirement, and you can see that does meet the new DOE standard, right? And they're referencing the AHRI 210-240 test standard. So hopefully that clears up EER2, SEER2, and what that's all about. And appreciate everybody for joining us, and hope you'll join us again next week for Andrew Schmidt, who will be presenting on an electrified option for outside air, VRV air handler integration kits. Thank you everybody for joining. Have a good day.